The morning after they lowered my husband into the ground, the house was already a carnival of greed. The roses from the casket spray still clung faintly to my black sweater, a ghost of sweetness masking the raw scent of damp soil and lilies. I came down the stairs slowly, one hand clutching the polished banister Harold had sanded himself years ago, the other steadying my knees. I expected stillness, respect, maybe even grief. Instead, laughter cracked the air like glass. They had gathered sons, daughters-in-law, grandchildren, cousins, not for mourning, but for the spoils. Their voices tumbled down the hallways, greedy and careless. "This one's mine," my grandson shouted, as though he were calling dibs on carnival prizes. He slapped neon green sticky notes onto the grandfather clock, the leather armchair, the cabinet holding our wedding china. A gallery of fluorescent flags sprouted across the furniture, tiny, cheerful claims upon the bones of my life. His sister waved her phone. "Scanning walls with a room mapping app will remodel once she's out," she said, turning in a slow circle. "Spa room. Definitely better lighting." She didn't lower her voice. She didn't even glance at me. I stood at the foot of the stairs, still wearing the black dress from the burial, still carrying the ache of widowhood in every breath. They did not pause for me. They did not offer me a chair. Instead, my daughter-in-law, Clarissa, appeared with a tray of champagne flutes and that polished smile of hers, the kind that looked rehearsed in the bathroom mirror. "We're celebrating Dad's legacy," she announced, handing glasses around as if she were hosting a gala. "He built an empire. Now we carry it forward." Someone in the corner muttered, "And clean out the ghosts." Laughter erupted. My chair at the dining table was gone, replaced with a wobbly folding chair dragged in from the garage, no cushion, one leg shorter than the others. When I sat, they nodded toward the mudroom instead. "You'll be more comfortable there, away from the noise." So I sat among the brooms and the mop bucket with a paper plate of cold chicken and rubbery potatoes. The sound of them drifted in, glasses clinking, shoes stomping through my hallways, sticky notes fluttering onto it like bright bruises. "This house smells like mothballs and death," one cousin said. "Let's get the kitchen," another added. "Rip out the wallpaper." My grandson darted into the mudroom, grinning as he slapped another neon sticker onto the sideboard. "This one's mine." Then he left without waiting for a reply. I held my tea with both hands so it would not tremble. Dad said she'd die before him, someone called from the dining room. Guess that was his only mistake. She built soup. He built an empire. Laughter again, sharp as knives. Let her rot with the memories. She doesn't even know what year it is. Can we keep her pension checks if we forward her mail? God, she's half dead already. Just give her the garden shed. I swallowed the chalky bite of chicken and let their words settle like ash. I did not argue. I did not cry. I reached instead into the pocket of my sweater and felt the edges of the document I had hidden for 15 years, a notarized bank memorandum, inked in blue, not black. My name sat clearly on that page, not as witness or dependent, but as co-founder, early investor, silent savior. They didn't know. They never asked. They never wanted to. Back then, when the company teetered on bankruptcy, when Harold returned home with his tie undone and shame hanging off him heavier than his coat, it wasn't lawyers who saved them. It wasn't his board. It wasn't my son or his cousins. It was me. I sold everything, the emerald necklace my mother left me, the bangles from my wedding chest, even the brooch I wore at my engagement party. Quietly, without a word, I wired the money. Quietly, I whispered, "Use it, but don't let them know it came from me." They hadn't known then. They didn't know now. I heard Joseph, my son, crowing in the next room. "We'll get the lake house. The boat's already under my name." "The Lexus is mine," someone else added. "Dad promised me last Christmas." "I want the Hermes scarves," my granddaughter demanded. "Even if they're hers, she's not using them." I sat in the mudroom among buckets and broken brooms, chewing on cold chicken, listening to them divide my skin while I still breathed inside it. At one point, a boy, Ethan, maybe, though I'd stopped keeping track, wandered in. He blinked at me surprised, then said casually, "There's bottled water in the garage fridge. Maybe grab one. You look pale." He didn't wait for an answer. I stayed seated an hour longer. long enough to hear drawers slamming upstairs as they packed my perfume bottles and silk scarves into boxes labeled donation, outdated, and old lady junk. Long enough to hear the thud of suitcases rolling down the hall as someone claimed my bedroom. Long enough to hear the sharp, careless laughter of youth sharpening itself against the bones of the old. By the time the champagne ran out and their music shut off, the house still thrummed with the echo of greed. I rose slowly, joints aching, and looked out the small window above the mudroom sink. The roses Harold had planted along the driveway were wilting, petals curling inward. No one had watered them since the funeral. No one noticed. My footsteps back into the hallway were light, the way they imagined a ghost's might be. Perhaps in their minds I was already gone, a shadow lingering where I wasn't wanted. But they were wrong. My pulse still beat, steady and undeniable. They had buried Harold yesterday. Today they began burying me. But I had one thing left they could not claim with stickers and careless words. I had the truth. And when the will was read, they would finally hear my name. There is a kind of silence that feels heavier than noise. After Harold died, the house was full of voices, greedy ones, careless ones, all chattering over the future. But when they finally left at night, the silence returned, pressing on me like a second body. I walked the halls with my hand trailing over the wallpaper, touching the outlines of my life, as if to remind myself that I still existed. It wasn't always like this. Once, before the neon stickers, before the whispered jokes about my age, before they stuffed me into the mudroom like an afterthought, this house held ambition. Fire. Plans scribbled on napkins, late nights by the kitchen table, Harold's tie loose around his neck, my hands steady with a pen. Just listen, he would say, pacing the kitchen tiles while the coffee percolated. If I can get them to see the numbers, if I can convince them we can scale, then the board will extend another quarter. His words spilled like marbles across the floor. I was the one who gathered them, sorted them, lined them in neat rows. I wrote the letters he signed. I polished the pitch decks he delivered. I slipped ideas into his sentences the way a seamstress hides stitches in a hem. He wore them into the boardroom, shined and pressed, and came home with contracts in hand. No one saw my hand in it. That was the rule. I learned early that my contributions had to be invisible. At family dinners, if I spoke too much about cash flow or partnerships, the cousins shifted in their seats. "You're too sharp," Harold warned once. "They'll resent you. Let me be the mouthpiece. It'll go smoother." So I let him speak. He stood under the spotlights while I stitched the curtain behind him. My name never made the minutes of a meeting, but my words did. The first time the company nearly collapsed, I was the one who saved it. Harold had mortgaged the house, drained the accounts, begged the board for mercy. Nothing worked. I knew the numbers better than he did. I saw the iceberg before he admitted we were sinking. So I opened the velvet box where my mother's emerald necklace lay. I lifted each jewel, felt its cool weight in my hand, and thought of my daughter's weddings, of the heritage I had promised to pass down. Then I carried it to the jeweler. The bangles went next. Then the brooch I wore the night Harold proposed. I handed them over quietly, one after another, the clerk's eyes softening as he wrote the receipts. I left the store lighter each time, though the weight in my chest grew heavier. When the money reached the bank, Harold's hands trembled. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I'm sure," I said. "But it must remain between us. Don't tell them." He nodded, relief flooding his face. "You saved us." But he didn't say it outside these walls. Not to the board. Not to our children. Not to the world. Instead, at the next investor dinner, he raised a glass. We tightened our belts, we pushed harder, and now we're back on track. They applauded. They toasted him. I sat silent, the taste of champagne sour on my tongue. This pattern repeated over the years. When contracts faltered, I rewrote proposals. When rivals circled, I drafted counteroffers. When the IPO loomed, Harold brought me the prospectus draft with his brow furrowed. I spent 3 sleepless nights polishing it until the numbers gleamed, the risks shrank, the vision soared. The bankers called it the cleanest IPO pitch we've ever seen. Harold took the credit. He didn't mean to erase me. He simply followed the current of the world, a current that preferred wives smiling in pearls, not women wielding pens. And I let him. Because love is compromise, isn't it? Because sometimes silence feels like devotion. Because the family needed stability more than I needed applause. But silence corrodes. Each time I bit my tongue, each time I nodded while someone praised Harold's genius, a piece of me dissolved. Years later, at a family gathering, one cousin boasted, "Uncle Harold built this empire from scratch." My granddaughter chimed in, "Dad says he did it all on his own." No one helped. They said this while I poured tea, my hands steady despite the storm in my chest. I realized then what silence had cost me. Not just recognition. Not just pride. But history itself. The story was already rewriting itself, smoothing me out of the narrative like an eraser across paper. They didn't remember that I was there in the basement when Harold wept over unpaid invoices. They didn't remember that it was my idea to pivot from industrial contracts to consumer products, the very shift that fueled their first million. They didn't remember that it was my handwriting on the draft IPO, my sleepless nights feeding their bright mornings. They didn't remember because I had taught them not to. Because every time Harold introduced me as the heart of the home, I smiled and said nothing. Because every time someone called me supportive, I nodded, though I was the scaffold. Supportive. What a small word for someone who kept the ceiling from collapsing. And so, when Harold died and they descended on the house with neon stickers and phone apps, I should not have been surprised. To them, I was furniture too. Outdated wallpaper. A relic to be stripped, boxed, or shuffled aside. What they never understood was that every empire has an architect hidden beneath its marble. I was the one who drew the lines, laid the bricks, mortared the cracks. Harold was the statue they unveiled, but I was the scaffolding that kept him upright until the unveiling. In my pocket now, hidden from their eyes, was proof. The bank memorandum. Not just my name scribbled in the margins, but carved into the bedrock. Co-founder. Investor. Silent partner. They believed my silence meant absence. They mistook invisibility for non-existence. But soon, when the will was read, when the papers were unsealed, they would learn what silence had been buying all along. And for the first time in decades, my voice would not be erased. The mudroom became my exile. It was Clarissa's idea. "She'll be more comfortable there," she said, sweeping her lacquered nails across the kitchen as though the sight of me unsettled the modern decor. Quiet. Close to the garden. Less drafty. And so they moved my chair, my plate, my teacup into the narrow space beside the washing machine. A folding chair. A TV tray. A thin cushion that flattened in a day. They shut the door halfway whenever guests came, the way people shield clutter from view. "This way you can rest, Mom," Joseph told me, his voice dripping false concern. "You'll have privacy." He patted my shoulder with the detachment of a nurse closing curtains around a patient. Privacy. Such a pretty word for erasure. From that corner, I listened to the rhythms of my own house, the slap of sticky notes onto furniture, the giddy squeal of children racing up the stairs, the stomp of boxes dragged down. My bedroom became their dressing room. My jewelry chest became their treasure hunt. My linens became their playthings. And I sat among detergent bottles and brooms, spooning cold soup into my mouth unseen. But silence, I had learned, can be weaponized. The laundry room, as they called it, became my fortress. At first, I pretended. I let my shoulders droop, let my hands tremble when they brought me food. "Poor thing," Clarissa murmured. "She's fading." They nodded and returned to their scavenger hunt. But when the door closed, my back straightened. My hands steadied. I opened the drawer beside the dryer and slid out the folder I had hidden years ago, the one no one thought to search, because no one imagined I had anything worth hiding. Inside were documents. Photocopies of contracts I'd drafted, bank transfers with my signature, letters Harold had scrawled in his desperate nights. We would not have survived without her. She mortgaged her jewels. She saved us. And, at the bottom, the notarized memorandum from the bank. Blue ink. My name. My role. My undeniable contribution. I spread them across the ironing board like tarot cards. Evidence. Memory. Truth. Each night, when the house fell silent, I reviewed them by the yellow bulb above the washer. I reread the IPO pitch I had polished until the words sang. I reread Harold's shaky thank you letter that he never mailed, afraid of scandal if the world knew his wife had saved the empire. I traced my own name in ink, reminding myself that I existed. In the mornings, I practiced. My voice had grown thin from decades of quiet, but I trained it back. I read aloud the words I would one day deliver. I was there. I was not a witness. I was the foundation. Sometimes I imagined the scene. The lawyer opening the will. The family leaning forward, hungry. Their smirks when my name wasn't called. And then the unveiling. The memorandum laid bare. The legal truth no sticky note could erase. I pictured their faces, shock curdling into disbelief, disbelief collapsing into rage. And then the silence. The silence I had waited for. In the afternoons, when they thought I was napping, I walked the garden. My roses had wilted, their petals bruised from neglect. I knelt anyway, trimming, watering, coaxing life back. They laughed from the porch. She talks to plants now. They didn't hear me talking to Harold. You promised to keep my name safe, I whispered to the soil. And you did, in your way. But now I must keep it alive. You left me the tools. You left me the proof. And I will use them. Sometimes, Joseph wandered in, smug. Mom, we'll sell the house. Market's hot. You'll be happier in a smaller place, don't you think? I only smiled faintly, folding his words into the growing file of their arrogance. Other times, Clarissa brought her friends to tour our future space. They pointed at my chair in the laundry room and chuckled. Cozy nook. Maybe make it a mudroom bench? Yes, Clarissa agreed. We'll redesign everything. It'll finally feel like ours. Ours. The word tasted sour. They thought me powerless, tucked between bleach bottles and dustpans. But every empire forgets that revolutions are born in basements, in kitchens, in laundries. In hidden rooms where those erased learn to gather their voices. I sharpened my resolve in that exile. Each insult, each careless laugh, each claim on furniture or jewelry became another stone in my wall of determination. One evening, I overheard them in the dining room. Dad built it all, Joseph said. On his own, Clarissa added. He'd roll in his grave if he knew she thought she mattered. The words burned, but they also clarified. They weren't just greedy. They were rewriting history in real time. My silence had trained them well. They believed in the myth so deeply they could not imagine its unraveling. Good. That would make the reveal all the more devastating. At night, in my narrow bed by the washer, I rehearsed again. Not just the facts, but the pauses, the weight of each phrase. I would not shout. I would not weep. I would deliver truth the way an architect unveils blueprints, precise, undeniable. The laundry room gave me that. Time. Privacy. The patience to polish my story until it gleamed. It also gave me something else, perspective. From my exile, I saw them clearly, stripped of pretense. They were not heirs. They were scavengers, circling a body they assumed had no spirit left. But I was not the body. I was the foundation. And foundations, though unseen, hold the power to collapse or uphold. So I waited. I let them box my scarves, tear my wallpaper, laugh at my roses. I let them think I was fading into the laundry's hum. But in truth, I was sharpening. Waiting for the moment the lawyer would call us together, papers in hand, and I would step out from the shadow of the washer into the blinding light of truth. And when I did, their sticky notes would peel, their neon claims would shrivel, and their empire of entitlement would crumble. The laundry room, their insult, had become my war room. The day of the will reading dawned with the brittle chill of autumn. The house smelled of dust and lilies, the kind of flowers that outlast grief, but never disguise it. The family gathered in the living room as though attending a coronation. They were dressed in black still, though their eyes gleamed not with sorrow but with anticipation. Joseph sat in Harold's armchair, already occupying the throne. Clarissa perched beside him, silk scarf looped carelessly around her neck, one of mine. My granddaughter lounged on the sofa, scrolling her phone. My grandson clutched a notebook as though preparing to catalog every asset. The cousins whispered in corners, their laughter muffled but not restrained. They believed this day would cement their inheritance. I sat in the folding chair by the wall, silent, my hands folded neatly in my lap. They did not offer me Harold's chair. They did not look at me at all. To them, I was the leftover guest at a banquet. The lawyer arrived precisely at noon, a tall man in a gray suit, carrying a leather briefcase. His shoes clicked across the hardwood as he set his papers on the coffee table. The family hushed, the air tightening with hunger. "Thank you all for gathering," the lawyer began, his voice dry as parchment. "We are here to read the last will and testament of Harold W." Joseph leaned forward, hands rubbing together. Clarissa whispered, finally. The lawyer adjusted his glasses. Harold left instructions for his estate to be divided in accordance with his expressed wishes. I will begin with general allocations, then proceed to the codicil, which contains critical clarifications. I caught the flicker of confusion across Joseph's face. Codicil. A word he hadn't expected. The lawyer unfolded the document and read in his measured cadence. To my children, I leave the lake house, under the condition it be maintained with dignity and never sold to strangers. Joseph grinned triumphantly. To my grandchildren, I leave educational trusts to be dispersed at maturity. Phones came out, notes were tapped. But then the lawyer's voice shifted, the rhythm slowing. And to my beloved wife, without whom this empire would never have stood. The room stilled. All eyes turned, at last, to me. I leave primary control of the intellectual property, the patents, and the founding shares, as she was the original investor and co-founder in truth, though not always in name. A silence as sharp as shattered glass followed. Then came the explosion. What? Joseph barked. That's absurd, Clarissa snapped, sitting forward. She didn't build anything, my granddaughter cried. The lawyer raised a hand, unbothered. Please. The codicil contains corroborating documentation. He opened the briefcase, withdrew the notarized bank memorandum, the letters, the contracts. Each bore my name, my signature, my proof. Blue ink. My handwriting. Undeniable. This cannot be right, Joseph sputtered, red creeping up his neck. Dad would never. He did, the lawyer cut in calmly. These documents were sealed 15 years ago. They carry full legal weight. Your mother was the silent architect of the company's survival and, accordingly, Harold designated her as co-founder with full rights. Their mouths opened and closed like fish gasping on shore. Clarissa's eyes narrowed to slits. She's senile. She must have tricked him. The lawyer slid another sheet forward. Harold's handwritten note, confirming in his own words, she saved us. She must be recognized. Witnessed. Dated. Sealed. I rose slowly from my folding chair, my hands steady. My voice, when it came, was soft but ironclad. I was there when he wept over the invoices. I was there when he mortgaged the house. I was there when the company nearly collapsed. I sold my mother's jewels to keep you afloat. I rewrote the pitch that brought in the investors you now worship. I stayed silent because that was the role you expected of me. But silence is not absence. Invisible does not mean non-existent. Their faces shifted, disbelief curdling into fury, fury cracking into fear. You can't do this, my grandson shouted. We already claimed everything. Sticky notes are not contracts, the lawyer replied coolly. You're stealing from us, Clarissa hissed. No, I said, finally standing tall. I am reclaiming what was mine all along. I looked at Joseph. His face was pale now, his jaw tight. You laughed when you thought me powerless. You stuffed me into the laundry room. You erased me in your stories. But history cannot be erased when it is written in ink and sealed in law. He tried to speak, but no words came. The lawyer continued unshaken. Furthermore, Harold's will stipulates penalties for any heir who attempts to displace or demean his wife in her rightful role. Any such behavior, documented and verified, results in forfeiture of their share. The silence that fell then was heavier than any insult they had ever thrown. I held their eyes, one by one. Grandchildren, cousins, daughter-in-law, son. Each stared back, stunned, as though the air itself had betrayed them. For years, I said, you told each other I was nothing. That I cooked soup while Harold built an empire. That I was half dead already, a shadow in the mudroom. You laughed while dividing what was never yours. Today, you learn the truth. I was the architect. Harold was the statue. You tried to erase me. But I remain. The lawyer closed the folder with a snap. This concludes the reading. The room remained frozen, the only sound the ticking of Harold's grandfather clock, the one with a neon sticker still clinging to its wood. My grandson's note read mine. I stepped forward, peeled the sticker off, and held it up between two fingers. No, I said simply. Then I dropped it into the trash. The empire of neon notes collapsed with it. The house was quiet again. Not the brittle silence of erasure, but the deep calm that follows a storm. The sticky notes were gone. The cousins had left in shame, their laughter silenced, their suitcases empty. Joseph no longer dared to sit in Harold's chair. Clarissa avoided my eyes entirely, as if contact might turn her to salt. For the first time in years, the house belonged to me. I walked its halls slowly, letting my hand brush the wallpaper they had mocked, the furniture they had tried to claim. The grandfather clock ticked steadily in the corner, mine once more. The china cabinet gleamed, unblemished by neon claims. Even the laundry room felt different now, no longer a prison, but a reminder, the place where I had sharpened myself, where silence became steel. But a house is only walls and echoes. What I wanted now was a life of my own making. So I made decisions. Swift ones. The lake house went to charity, a retreat for battered women, a place where silence could heal rather than erase. The cars were sold. The proceeds funded a scholarship for young girls in engineering, the kind of bright minds the world too often dimmed. My jewelry, what little remained after I had pawned so much, was set aside for a foundation I would build, the Forgotten Architects Fund. It would support women whose labor was erased, whose names were left off patents, whose hands built empires only to be told they were invisible. I knew too many stories like mine. Now, those stories would not fade. When the lawyer asked if I wanted to keep the main house, I shook my head. Too many ghosts. Instead, I sold it, every room scrubbed of sticky notes, every corner free of laughter that had cut like knives. The proceeds gave me freedom, not just comfort, but choice. I chose the sea. The cottage was small, weather-worn, perched on a cliff where the waves broke like thunder. The paint peeled in places, the shutters creaked in the wind, but it breathed with honesty. No heirs circling, no cousins measuring square footage. Just salt air and horizon. I planted roses along the garden path. Harold had loved roses. I whispered to them as I watered, not with grief now, but with gratitude. He had carried the credit, yes, but he had also carried the burden. He had kept my secret because the world was not ready. But he had left me the proof. In his last act, he had given me back my name. Each morning, I rose before dawn and sat by the window overlooking the sea. I wrote in notebooks, not speeches, not IPO drafts, not letters for Harold to sign, but my own story. My voice unfiltered. I wrote of the nights by the kitchen table, the jewels sold in silence, the pitches polished until they gleamed. I wrote of the mudroom exile, the sticky notes, the wool reading. Most of all, I wrote of the truth, that invisibility is not absence. That women like me have always been the scaffold, the mortar, the hidden foundation. That the world builds statues to men but forgets the architects who kept them standing. The foundation published my writings under my name. Invitations began to arrive, universities, conferences, panels. At first I declined, wary of bright lights after so many years in shadow. But then I remembered the laundry room, and I said yes. The first time I spoke publicly, the auditorium was full of young women in sharp suits, pens poised, eyes alight. My voice trembled at first, but then it steadied. I told them. They tried to erase me. They thought silence meant absence. They thought invisibility meant nothingness. But history is written in ink, not neon stickers. And I am here. You're here. Never let them make you vanish. The applause rose like waves against the cliff. At night, I returned to my cottage, to the sea and the roses, to the quiet I had chosen. Loneliness no longer pressed against me like a second body. It had transformed into solitude, a companion instead of a jailer. One evening, as the sun dipped into the horizon, Joseph arrived. He stood awkwardly at the garden gate, a man suddenly small without entitlement to prop him. His eyes were tired, his shoulders slumped. "I didn't know," he said finally. I thought, Dad. You thought what you wanted to think, I interrupted gently. He winced. I'm sorry. I studied him, my son, the boy I had once rocked to sleep, now a man stripped of illusions. Forgiveness did not come easily, but bitterness no longer burned in me either. I nodded once. Learn from it. Tell your children the truth. He did. In time, my grandchildren came to visit. They asked questions. They listened. They wrote essays about me for school projects. For the first time, I saw my name in their handwriting, not erased, not mocked, but honored. The story had begun to rewrite itself. Not because they gave it back to me, but because I took it. Because I peeled off their stickers and replaced them with ink. Because I chose to stand in the light rather than fade in the laundry room. The sea kept crashing, relentless, eternal. The roses bloomed. My notebooks filled with words that were mine alone. And when I looked back at the woman eating cold chicken in exile, listening to laughter in the next room, I did not pity her. I honored her. She had endured. She had sharpened in silence. She had waited for her moment, and when it came, she did not falter. The empire still bore Harold's name in public, but in my heart, and now, in history, it bore mine too. The architect reclaimed. The erased restored. And that is enough.